I used to believe silence was strength. That if I endured long enough, life would eventually reward me for being patient, for not asking for too much, for not making things complicated. I was wrong. Silence didn't protect me. It erased me. The first time I felt it happening, I ignored it. A small moment, easy to dismiss. I wanted something, nothing outrageous, nothing destructive, and I didn't say it out loud. I chose not to inconvenience anyone. I chose not to risk rejection. I told myself it wasn't important enough to matter. That choice became a habit. Years later, I realized that most of my life had been built from moments exactly like that, moments where I stayed quiet not because I had nothing to say, but because saying it felt dangerous. Dangerous to comfort. Dangerous to stability. Dangerous to the version of me everyone already understood. I learned early how to be agreeable. How to read a room and adjust myself accordingly. People liked me for it. They said I was easy to be around. Flexible. Low maintenance. What they didn't see was how much of myself I was folding away to fit. From the outside, my life looked calm. Predictable. Functional. There were no disasters. No visible breakdowns. Just a steady progression of days that looked like progress if you didn't look too closely. Inside, I felt like I was constantly holding my breath. Every decision I made was filtered through the same question: what will cause the least disruption? I didn't ask what I wanted. I asked what would keep things smooth. I called that maturity. What it really was fear disguised as reason. I feared conflict. I feared disappointment. I feared being misunderstood. But most of all, I feared discovering that what I wanted might not be worth the cost of pursuing it. So I stayed quiet. I stayed quiet when relationships began to hollow out. When conversations turned into routines. When affection became obligation. I stayed because leaving would require explaining something I barely understood myself. I stayed quiet at work, too. When I felt out of place. When I felt capable of more but terrified of failing publicly. I watched opportunities pass by and told myself they weren't meant for me anyway. That lie kept me safe for a while. Then it started to rot. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself. From editing your thoughts before they reach your mouth. From living as a version of yourself that requires maintenance. I was tired in a way sleep didn't touch. At night, I would replay conversations that never happened. Things I wished I had said. Boundaries I never set. Choices I never claimed. Those imaginary versions of me felt more real than the one waking up every morning to repeat the same careful routine. I began to feel detached from my own life, like I was observing it instead of participating. Days passed quickly but left no memory behind. Weeks blurred. Months disappeared. Time didn't feel stolen. It felt surrendered. The breaking point didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with a question that surfaced one quiet evening when I had nothing to distract myself. If I continue like this, will anyone ever know who I really was? That question terrified me because I didn't know the answer. I had spent so long minimizing myself that I wasn't sure what remained. I had become skilled at survival, but survival isn't the same as living. It just looks similar from far away. I realized then that I had been making ethical choices for years, or at least I thought I was. I believed I was being kind by staying quiet. That I was protecting others from discomfort. That I was choosing peace. But whose peace was it? Really, mine had been missing for a long time. The quiet despair crept in slowly. Not sadness. Not anger. Just a constant awareness that something essential was being neglected. Like ignoring a warning light on a dashboard because the car is still moving. I told myself I would speak up someday. That someday, the timing would be right. That someday, I would feel confident enough, brave enough, certain enough. Someday became the place where my real life waited. And the longer I waited, the more distant it felt. One night, lying awake, I understood something that changed the way I saw everything: silence isn't neutral. It takes sides. And every time I chose not to speak, not to act, not to risk being seen, silence chose against me. That was the moment I understood that my life hadn't slipped away all at once. I had been giving it up quietly, decision by decision, because it felt safer than finding out who I might become if I stopped. Once I understood that silence was taking sides, I couldn't unsee it. Every quiet moment became loud. Every unspoken thought pressed harder against my chest. The same life I had learned to navigate effortlessly suddenly felt hostile, like a room where the air was slowly being removed and everyone else seemed perfectly fine. I tried to return to my old habits. To smooth things over internally. To convince myself that this discomfort was temporary. That I was overthinking. That adulthood simply felt like this. But the lie no longer held. The more honest I became with myself, the more exhausted I felt pretending for others. Conversations that once felt harmless now drained me completely. I found myself agreeing to things automatically, then resenting myself minutes later for doing it again. I began to notice how often I said it doesn't matter. About my time. About my preferences. About my boundaries. It mattered. I just didn't believe I was allowed to matter too. The moral dilemma crept in slowly. Speaking up wouldn't just change my life, it would disrupt other people's comfort. People who were used to me being predictable. Easy. Adaptable. I had trained them well. Breaking that pattern felt cruel. I told myself that staying quiet was the kinder choice. That silence spared others confusion and disappointment, but deep down, I knew the truth: I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting the image they had of me. And that image was costing me my sense of self. There were moments when I almost spoke. When the words rose to the surface, sharp and clear. In those moments, my heart would race, my hands would shake, and my mind would flood with consequences. Questions I couldn't answer. Reactions I couldn't control. So I swallowed the words. Every time I did, something inside me shrank. I started to feel resentment, not loud, explosive resentment, but a quiet bitterness that made me ashamed of myself. I resented people for not seeing me, even though I had spent years hiding. I resented their expectations, even though I had helped create them. That resentment turned inward quickly. I blamed myself for being weak. For waiting too long. For not having the courage to change earlier, when the cost would have been lower. I wondered how many years you could live like this before something broke permanently. The answer, I learned, is longer than you think, but not forever. The mental breakdown didn't announce itself. It arrived as disconnection. I would be in the middle of something, a conversation, a task, a moment that should have felt real, and suddenly feel detached, like I was watching my body perform from a distance. I functioned. I smiled. I responded. But I wasn't there. That scared me more than panic ever had. I realized I had spent years practicing absence. Training myself to disappear emotionally while remaining physically present. Silence had taught me how to leave without going anywhere. The thought that shook me most was simple: if I died tomorrow, would anyone know what I wanted? Not what I did. Not what I provided. What I wanted. The answer was no. That realization hit harder than any regret about missed opportunities. Because it meant that even the people closest to me knew only the version of myself I had curated for safety. I began to understand that my silence wasn't just harming me. It was preventing real connection. People weren't choosing to misunderstand me, I was choosing not to be known. But knowing that didn't make the choice easier. Breaking silence felt like betrayal. Of roles. Of history. Of the unspoken agreements that had kept everything stable. I worried that once I spoke, there would be no way to take the words back. That the calm I had preserved would shatter into something messy and irreversible. I stood at that edge for a long time. Speak and risk losing the life I had built. Stay silent and continue losing myself. There was no option that didn't hurt. What finally tipped the balance wasn't hope or courage. It was exhaustion. I was tired of carrying unspoken truths. Tired of managing reactions before they happened. Tired of living a life where my deepest thoughts were treated like inconveniences. One quiet moment, with no audience and no drama, I admitted something I had avoided for years: silence had stopped being a choice. It had become a cage. And cages don't open themselves. When I finally accepted that silence had become a cage, I didn't feel liberated. I felt exposed. For so long, silence had been my protection. It kept me safe from conflict, from rejection, from the risk of being misunderstood. Without it, I didn't know how to exist. I had no practice being fully seen. No language for asking without apologizing. No confidence that my truth deserved space. But I also knew this: staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was actively destroying me. I didn't break the silence all at once. I didn't make a speech or demand change. I started with smaller, trembling acts of honesty. Saying no when I meant no. Admitting uncertainty instead of pretending agreement. Letting discomfort exist without immediately smoothing it over. Each time felt wrong. Selfish. Excessive. That's how you know you've been silent too long. The reactions were mixed. Some people adjusted. Some didn't. Some were confused. A few were hurt. I carried the guilt of that heavily, questioning whether I was doing the right thing or simply correcting too late in a way that caused unnecessary damage. But something unexpected happened. I began to recognize myself again. Not the confident version I once imagined I would become, but a real one. Awkward. Hesitant. Imperfect. A person who didn't always know what they wanted, but was finally willing to admit when something felt wrong. I learned that silence doesn't only erase you, it teaches others how to ignore you. Breaking it doesn't guarantee understanding, but it does make honesty possible. And honesty, I discovered, is painful in a cleaner way. I won't pretend everything improved. Some doors closed permanently. Some relationships could not survive the shift. There are people who preferred the quiet version of me, and I understand why. That version was easier. Less demanding. Less real. Letting that go hurt more than I expected. But staying would have hurt more. I still grieve the years I spent disappearing politely. The choices I delayed until they no longer made sense. The voice I silenced until it nearly forgot how to speak. That grief doesn't vanish. It softens, then returns, then softens again. That's part of living honestly. What I gained wasn't certainty or happiness in the way people promise. What I gained was ownership. Of my discomfort. Of my time. Of my presence in my own life. I no longer confuse peace with numbness. I no longer confuse patience with fear. I no longer believe that being easy to live with is the same as being alive. If you are listening to this and recognizing yourself the quiet one, the adaptable one, the one who waits, I want you to hear this clearly: silence feels safe because it delays consequences. But it also delays your life. You don't need to become loud, you don't need to become fearless. You just need to stop disappearing for the comfort of others. I stayed quiet while my life slipped away. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I was afraid of what speaking would cost me. Now I understand the truth I wish I had faced sooner: silence always costs more.